Okay, well, here it is, right? The completed restoration of this 1986 model. It's a 50 watt JMP bass amp. Right, so have a look at part one, and I'll give a pretty detailed overview of what's going on this board. So let's just talk about what I've done with respect to kind of the restoration here, right? This is all left alone. I haven't touched any of this. New bias caps are in. Okay. We have completely rebuilt the rectifier section of this. If you go back and have a look at part one, I might flick a couple of photos up now of the previous arrangement. It was a bit of a mess, right? So I've reused there were 4 turrets here that were available. So I've wired up a 2-phase rectifier with 2 rectifier diodes in series here. Because, well, 2 reasons, right? I wanted to be able to bridge the gap here, but this is also quite a nice technique to use in the event that one of these fails short. You'll still have a functioning amp. I have completely rewired the standby switch, right? So the way this was wired before, it was a break after the rectifier, and they're only using one side of this double pole, double throw switch here. So now I've wired it per the traditional schematic from Marshall for this era, 1970, right? Where we're coming off the high voltage secondaries here on the power transformer to either side of the switch, right? And then from the other side of the switch on the double pole, double throw into these rectifier diodes. And then from after the rectifiers, we are into a brand new mains filter cap. All right, so there was a filter cap. Well, there was no filter cap there, right, when the amp that was received. Go and check the video on part one. Instead, it was kind of shoehorned in here. It was only 47 microfarad. Okay. Now we've got 50 plus 50, and it's bridged in parallel. This is 100 microfarad per Marshall spec. We have a new screens and phase inverter filter cap as well, 50 plus 50. This has all been rewired. I've reused all the existing, the vintage wiring here that was already in place. And under the board is a new 50 plus 50 can cap for the preamp as well, right? So complete recap. If you're going to recap your amp, do your bias caps at the same time. I called out in the part one video that the base spec, the 1986 model, does not have screen resistors. Right, so I put those in here. These are 1K 5 watt screen resistors. Also no grid stoppers in the 1986 base spec. So while I was there, I put those in as well. These are 5K 6 1 watt carbon film resistors right on pin 5, grid stoppers. Negative feedback, pretty simple, right? This negative feedback's a 47K, and it was stuck on the speaker jack. Now, the problem with putting your negative feedback on the speaker jack is that when you change the impedance selector, depending on the cab that you're using, you're actually changing the negative feedback in the amp. It'll change the sound, the tone, the feel of the amp, right? It's pretty old school. I wouldn't recommend it. So I have moved this, and again, this is actually per the Marshall schematic, the 1986-1970 scheme that we looked at in the part one video. It's now on the 8 ohm tap on the impedance selector, right? So regardless of whether you're using a 4, 8 or 16 ohm cab, the amp will be getting the same negative feedback. And the final thing that we have done to this thing in terms of the restoration, and arguably was the most difficult part of it, was putting a new choke in. Difficult because just the access to this without, I didn't want to rip this whole board out and unsolder everything, so you kind of got to do it. You got to be kind of pretty careful about that. But there is a brand new choke on here now, And what I will do is we'll use the LCR meter again, and I'll take some measurements of the new filter caps, and we'll measure the inductance of the new choke as well. And if we compare them to some of the measurements in the part 1 of the video, pretty intriguing, right? And I think gives a few clues and things to look for when you get an amp like this on your bench and you're asked to diagnose it and try and find out what might be good about it and what might be not so good. So let's get the old LCR meter up and running. Right, so first thing I'm going to do is let's just take some capacitance readings on these new filter caps, and you can see the kind of measurements that we can get even though it's still in circuit. Now look at that. Again, I mentioned this in the last video, part 1 video. The LCR meter, you can measure the properties of these components at a particular frequency, right? So rather than measuring kind of linear resistances and so on, this is actually able to measure the properties at a particular frequency. So we're now dealing with things like reactance and inductance, and obviously here capacitance at 100 hertz. The reason we choose 100 hertz is because the mains filter cap is dealing with a rectified AC, 50 hertz here in Australia, so it's 100 hertz. This is the exact frequency that this component will be dealing with. And you can see my F&T cap here, beautifully right on. I'm going to call that 100 microfarad, right? It's close enough too. Now let's move along. Just keep the ground position there, and I'm going to go straight on to the screen. This is the screen node, right? I'm going to call that 50. Right on spec. Here's the phase inverter, right? Fantastic. Can't beat new components, right? And let's move across and let's have a look at what's going on with the let's go and have a look at what's going on with the can cap for the preamp. So this is for V2, right? 51, and this is for V1. This side here. Get this right. 52, right? So these are bang on. Now, one of the things that I want to talk about, which made sense to me after the fact in the part 1 video, I measured the capacitance of the mains filter cap, which is actually, it was here, right? It was on the board. It was an axial cap sitting here, and it measured 82. I think it was definitely 80. I'm going to say 82 microfarad is my memory. And then when I pulled that cap out, it was a 47 microfarad cap. And I thought, oh, I know what happened, right? What actually happened was because the choke was short-circuited, right? We found that in the part 1 video. The choke had short-circuited, had absolutely no inductance. So you measured the henries on it with the meter, and it basically measured 0. So what was occurring is that you basically have a short circuit between the mains filter cap, which was here on the board, but I'm pointing to where it is now, and the screen supply filter cap. Right, so these would basically bridge together in the previous amp. So we had, 47, let's call it 50, right? And that was a 32 plus 32 there. So it was 50 plus 30, it's 80, 82, right? So it was measuring 82. So these things were actually bridged together. So from a kind of B plus power supply line, your mains filter and the screens filter were tied together and acting like one reservoir, which is not ideal, right? It's not fantastic. And I think it was a contributor to why I thought the amp kind of got mushy and broke up far too early. And to me, didn't sound like the kind of response I was expecting from a 50-watt Marshall, albeit a base spec, you know, and I know it's not going to break up like a lead circuit would through the preamp, but I did feel that the power amp section in this thing was a bit kind of spongy and underwhelming, quite frankly. So we will do in the video today, I want to kind of demonstrate what this thing obviously sounds like now, on the basis that correcting the fault in the power supply, as well as updating all of the filter caps, will make, you know, what I would call a material difference, a material improvement to the amp. Okay, so the last measurement I'd like to make here and show you guys is the new choke. All right, so we're in inductor mode, L. All right, and I'm going to connect the meter from, this is the screen supply node here, which is one end of the choke, over to the HT fuse, which is the other end, right? So this red wire here, the brown, is the primary of the output transformer. The red is one end of the choke, and the other end of the choke comes back onto here into the screen supply. Right, and you can see that I'm getting a crazy reading. Now this is where, you know, measuring these components in circuit sometimes gives you readings that don't make any sense, because, you know, you're not necessarily getting a reading that's connecting just at the two ends of the component that you're connecting to. It's going through the whole circuit and you're getting some crazy stuff. So one little trick here, just with the choke, is I can pull the HT fuse out and look at that, right? Because now my meter here is not going through and kind of getting readings from the mains section of the B+ line. So 4.5 Henrys on that choke, which is cool, right? That's just kind of, you know, let's call that right on spec, and we're happy with that. What I think I'll do now is we'll get this amp cranked up with a test signal on the oscilloscope, and I just want to compare the how kind of true the signal is at the output of the amp, and we'll kind of compare that waveform to what it was like before we made these restoration changes to the amp with the new filter caps and the new choke. Okay, so the amp is powered up. It's in standby at the moment, but I've just set this up with my normal kind of setup for the scope here, right? So we have, I've dialed up, this oscilloscope has a signal generator built in, right? So I send 1 kilohertz at 150 millivolts is the amplitude, right? That's that there. It's coming into the front end of the amp, and I've got the probe, which will actually measure, which I'll switch to now. Right now we're looking at the probe, and we'll put it on to measuring. We're going to measure the amplitude of the amplified sine wave that is going to go through the preamp and the power amp of this thing, right? So bring this out of standby. Turn the generator on. So as you can see, even with the amp off, there's a little bit of signal bleed there. That's normal in a 4-hole Marshall. So now I'm bringing the volume up here. I'm bringing up the volume on the bright channel because I'm actually on the bright channel here. But this amp's so kind of clean on the preamp that it doesn't really matter. It only clips once you actually start to drive the phase inverter and the power amp itself. Now, this is a beautiful sine wave, right? That is just crystal. Right? We compare that, I think, to the sine wave that this thing was putting out in part 1. I think we'll find not as pure, not as clean. This is looking pretty healthy to me. So I'm just going to kind of bring this into clipping here, and you see Right now we're driving this thing into overdrive in the power amp. Right, so it's still a 50 watt, right? We haven't done anything in that regard. But this is running into a 16 ohm load. So I'm going to say, look, probably at that point there, the wave is starting to lose its shape, right? So I'm going to say that that's not RMS clean. This would be clean. Let's call it here. Right, so we'll do some calculations on screen using these figures here to calculate what clean RMS power this amp is now putting out. All right, so let's see how this thing's sounding now, right? Same conditions as part one. Bring it up. To me, immediately this amp sounds cleaner, got more headroom, and it feels quite responsive. What are we at? We're at, I'm up at about 3 on the volume here. I've got bass, middle, treble all at midday, and the presence is just over midday, probably at 1 p.m. Alright, so let's move to the humbucker and let's see how that sounds with this thing. Alright, that's with the volume still at 5, right, at midday. This thing just breaks up. It just sounds far more like it's together, right? When I was kind of doing this with the amp before we fixed up the power supply and recapped it, would just kind of fall apart. I found it just kind of really mushy, right? So this is actually holding together much nicer. I'm going to bring this volume up here, kind of around about, let's call it 6.5, give or take. Bring these mids up a bit. And the presence is up at about, we're about 3 p.m. now. So starting to get a bit more hair on this tone now. Yeah, you could play rhythm guitar with that tone all day, couldn't you? All right, let's bring it back a bit. I want to go back to the single coil on this thing. And this is kind of, I think, the amp in the kind of the sweet spot for this thing is around here somewhere. it's a cool tone, right? And this is a cool amp. I'll be recommending to Sean, the owner, that we keep this as a 1986 bass spec, right? It's got something special about it. Keep it stock. This amp is as old as I am, right? Who wants to change it, right? It's cool as it is. All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed the restoration of this thing over 2 parts, right? If you haven't watched part 1, go back and have a look at it, right? You'll get some tones, you'll get an idea of what this thing sounded like when I received it. If you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, then please consider doing so. Like, subscribe, you'll be informed of when I release new content. I hope you enjoyed the video, guys, and I'll see you next time.